The Stanley Cup playoffs are finally here, and the Edmonton Oilers are facing the LA Kings for the third straight year. Nick Zararis of Locked On Oilers is here to preview the series for us and tell us what it'll take for the Oilers to emerge victorious. All that and more next on the Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome, everybody, to the Monday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150. Win or lose, visit fanduel.com/lockedon to get started. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the show a very familiar face and voice for Locked On NHL fans, Nick Zararis, who is now covering the Edmonton Oilers for us. And Nick, third straight year, it's Oilers Kings. What does it mean when these two teams face each other 3 straight years for the intensity and the rivalry that's created in a series like this?
It's been weird because you go back and look at some of these series. LA has won game one, both of the first two both series, the last 2 times they've played. One of them in overtime. One of them, the Oilers had a lead in the second period, and then the Kings scored 3 straight goals. And then as the series has progressed, there's been that natural cat and mouse game where the Kings are pretty structured, they're pretty well disciplined, and the Oilers use their speed to kind of break that down over the course of a series. And that back and forth, it's really interesting because that's typically how you're going to go about slowing down a more talented and a faster team. You're going to stick to your structure and you're going to try and force that other team to slow it down. And there's got to be real animosity at this point that 3 straight years, the Kings have played reasonably well in some of these series where I don't know if I would say they deserve to win, but they were right there. I mean, you force a game 7 last year, a little bit more separation between the two, but this year the Kings had a very up and down season. The Oilers came out of the gate about as cold as you possibly can, and then the Oilers were the best team in the league once they switched their coach. So there's a lot of underlying stuff that makes this really interesting, and I can't wait to see how the first game kind of plays out, how they feel each other out. That's the best part of a game 1, where the 2 teams come out and you want to see if they're going to be pedal to the metal or if they're both going to show a little trepidation and kind of ease their way into the game.
Yeah, should be interesting. You talked about the structure. What is your biggest concern from an Oilers perspective when facing the Kings?
The secondary scoring for the Oilers. The Kings are a deeper team. If you go player by player, forwards and defense, the Kings have more guys. You know, this is a team that was playing Quentin Byfield on their 4th line at points in April. This is a team that's played Pierre-Luc Dubois on their 3rd and 4th line for large stretches of the season. Those guys are just better than who the Oilers have in their 3rd and 4th line spots. So the depth is really going to be the key. And as far as what worries me, if the Oilers decide to load up and put McDavid and Draisaitl on one line, where's the rest of the offense going to come from? Because those 2 guys are going to do their jobs. I mean, over the last 2 years, they have 44 points in 13 games against the Kings in the playoffs. They're otherworldly, but they do need a little help, whether it's Nugent Hopkins, whether it's Zach Hyman, if Evander Kane is healthy and draws in, or maybe it's somebody a little bit more unexpected, like maybe it's Corey Perry, maybe it's Dylan Holloway. They're going to need somebody else other than McDavid and Draisaitl to score a goal at some point in this series.
Any updates on Evander Kane and his status heading in?
He's probably going to be a game time decision. The Oilers have been very obtuse about revealing what he's dealing with. They've just disclosed he hasn't been able to play or practice. They haven't said if it's upper body, lower body, if it's sick, just that he's day to day. He might play, he might not play.
As far as the finish to the season, I mean, the Oilers struggled a little bit down the stretch. Was this just sort of taking your foot off the gas because there was nothing important to play for the last few games, or is it a concern?
I think it's a little of both. I think both can be true simultaneously. Anytime you're not playing and you're sitting out a game, it's going to be you're going to have that little bit of adjustment period. Hockey's a little bit different than the other sports where if you sit for a day, even if it's a meaningless game, the reps in a game are always going to be more difficult than the reps that are in practice. So even if you're a good player, playing in the game helps. It keeps you at game speed. So I do think some of it is that they had nothing to play for. They were locked into that 2 spot pretty early on in the month of April. But at the same time, you can be a little worried about how they played. You know, that the effort they had against Arizona was not great. The last game of the season, the effort there was not great, but they didn't dress everybody. The intensity wasn't there. There was nothing to play for. So both can be true.
So give me a name. You mentioned that, secondary scoring is going to be important. Give me a player in the bottom 6 forwards or maybe on the bottom 2 pairs of defensemen who might step in and be a difference maker for the Oilers.
My hope, and I know a lot of Oilers fans' hope, is that they give Dylan Holloway a little bit of run. A first-round pick from a couple years ago. Hasn't played a whole lot. He's 10, 11 minutes a game. He's got some of that high-end offensive skill you would like to see from a first-round pick. But being that the Oilers are such a veteran-laden team, being that their expectations are so high, they're not as inclined to give a young guy an opportunity to kind of figure it out as the season develops. I would think him. I really liked the Adam Henrique edition. He hasn't put up a ton of counting stats since he's arrived in Edmonton, but I could see him chipping in with a timely goal somewhere along the line here, especially if the Oilers try and separate all of their high-end guys from each other, where if Henrique is riding shotgun with one of McDavid or Draisaitl, and then you can throw Nugent Hopkins with one of them and Hyman with one of them and Evander Kane with one of them and kind of diversify where you're getting your offense from across 2 lines, that makes the Oilers a lot more dangerous. I think conceptually, I think the ideal outcome for Oilers fans and the Oilers in this series is McDavid and Draisaitl play well enough separate from each other that you have 2 lines going at all times. And then you can effectively have at least one of those 2 on the ice. I want to say close to a third, if not half of the game, if you separate them from each other. And then you're really going to be able to control the game when you have that level of talent and you can separate it from each other.
Yeah, that does make sense. Talk to me about the goaltending situation. I kind of wonder whether or not Stuart Skinner gets enough credit. How do you think he will do in this series, and how important is his performance?
I think he's probably the single biggest way the Kings hang around in the series. When you're talking about how a team pulls off the upset, they're typically going to need their goalie to steal a game, or they're going to need at least one win in overtime. In this case, you get Skinner a little flustered, the goals start coming in. He's been really good. Since they changed coaches, since the defense tightened up, he's been really good. I want to say the thing I was reading in The Athletic this morning, like a .916 save percentage since they switched from Woodcroft to Knobloch. So the defense has been a little bit better. His workload has been a little bit less challenging, so he's been able to play better. But you don't know. These games are very compressed. We're talking about 7 games maximum over the course of 2 weeks. Weird things happen. Jack Campbell had better stats in the playoffs than Stuart Skinner last year, and he only came in relief of blowouts. So Skinner is the type of guy where I believe he's capable of playing at a reasonably high level, but until he does it in the playoffs, you're going to always have that little bit of hesitation.
Totally understandable. Your prediction for the series and why it's going to be that way.
I've picked Oilers in 6. I feel the talent disparity at the top of the lineup is really what separates them. That's been the case in the postseason the last 2 times. I mean, Draisaitl had 12 points on one leg 2 years ago with a partially torn ACL and really kind of swung that series. The Kings, they're not as deep as they've been in years past. I know I said before they're a deeper team than the Oilers, but when you trade 3 guys from Dubois, you have to get rid of Sean Druzy as a cap casualty. They have a talented group. There are other matchups in the West. I feel I would have been more inclined to take the Kings, but we've seen this. We've seen how high-end talent teams like the Oilers with speed and skill typically fare against these slow, plodding teams that kind of want to grind it out. The Kings will win a couple of games in this series. They definitely can make it hairy, but I think the talent disparity at the top of the lineup is just too much for this Kings team. The goaltending situation in LA too. Cam Talbot has been very hot and cold. I mean, he almost blew that game against the Blackhawks, the last game of the season, where he gave up 3 goals on 4 shots in about 4.5 minutes of that game. So the Oilers have enough talent to pull away. It's simply just a matter of, do the Kings steal 2 or 3 games?
All right, Nick, why don't you tell our viewers and our listeners where they could find the podcast and where they could find you on social media?
Yeah, having a very fun time as the interim host of Locked On Oilers. Me and Chris Knobloch both hopefully going to be holding our interim titles to the middle of June. Wherever you get your podcast, make sure you're subscribed. And over on Twitter, my handle is just my name, at Nick Zararis, Nick, Zararis.
All right, Nick, thanks so much, and good luck in the playoffs.
Same to you.
Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL. Baseball's in full swing, and FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150, win or lose. You can bet on everything from slap shots to home runs to slam dunks, all on an app that is safe, secure, and easy to use. So check out the odds and prop bets for your favorite NHL team as the Stanley Cup playoffs continue. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn and make your first bet an automatic win. FanDuel.com/LockedOn. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook.